I call to order this a workshop of the Carrabelle City Commission. It's for listing of the on the National Register of Proposed Historic District. It's April the 6th, 2023. It's 4:30 p.m. and we're conducting this workshop in the Carrabelle City Hall chambers. We have Mr. Waber here. And you're Mr. Waber. Yeah, all right, thank you. Good to put a face to a voice. And we're not going to have a prayer and a pledge because it's a workshop. So welcome all. I'm glad you're here today. And please, thank you for silencing your phones. And this workshop is for public information only. No action will be taken by the commission whatsoever. We're going to hear from Mr. Andrew Waber first. And then we'll have questions and comments from the commission and staff, and that'll be followed by questions and comments from the citizens and property owners who will have a one-time visit to the podium and for a 5-minute period since there's so few people here today. And then we'll have questions and comments again from the commission members, but Mr. Waber has a presentation first, and for this meeting goes the same as our regular meetings. Loud outburst and calling out from your seats is not allowed, and you'll be requested to leave the workshop if that does happen. So our topic of discussion is nomination of the downtown commercial core, which they have outlined, of the city of Carrabelle for placement on the National Register of Historic Places as a National Historic District. So Mr. Waber, if you'll
Can you hear me?
To you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, hello, my name is Andrew Waber. I've been working with several of the community, Tamara Allen and Michael Page and a few other people. We've been working to get this district put together. And so what I'm going to kind of do with this presentation, I'm going to kind of start by just going over what the NR is, talk a little bit about some of the benefits, about our evaluations and what we base it upon, and then talk a little bit about the Carrabelle Historic District. And so that's pretty much it. It's not going to be super intensive, but it's just kind of to get the information out there. So we're going to do, there we go. So again, this is an introduction to what we're going to kind of go over. Again, we're going to go over what is the National Register, what the criteria are, what does the listing mean for the owner, how is the property listed, and how does an owner object to listing, and then we're going to kind of go over the proposed historic district. So kind of a little bit of an introduction to the National Register. So the National Register of Historic Places was created as a result of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This act was passed in response to the large urban renewal programs of the mid-20th century, which often resulted in widespread destruction of entire communities with little to no community input. The National Register itself is a National Park Service program that is managed through state historic preservation offices. And according to the National Park Service, they officially define the National Register as the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. I personally feel, however, that this definition can be a bit misunderstood, as I will explain later. The NR was created in part to help establish a baseline for evaluation for buildings, structures, objects, and sites, and it is really a kind of a key part of the larger operation of what we do at the State Historic Preservation Office, and it's really a key part of sort of our larger effort to identify, evaluate, and protect historical resources. So kind of moving along. So what properties can be listed? For the purposes of the National Register, there are 4 general classifications of resource types. So we have buildings, structures, sites, and objects. Buildings are defined as a building created principally to shelter any form of human activity, and it can include ancillary buildings such as barns and garages, but obviously, the usual suspects like the schools, the city halls, the houses, and things of that nature, anything designed for human habitation. Structures are construction that are built primarily for the purposes other than human shelter or habitation. So for instance, a bridge, a road, a fence line, and things of that nature. Sites are defined as the location of a significant event, prehistoric occupation or activity, or a building or structure, whether standing, ruined, or vanished, where the location itself possesses historical, cultural, or archaeological value, regardless of the value of any built structure. And sites can include archaeological sites, designed landscapes, cemeteries, battlefields, so on and so forth. Objects are loosely defined as constructions that are primarily artistic in nature or relatively small in scale and simply constructed. Objects are often either by nature or design movable and can be tied to a specific setting or environment. So an example of an object would be a sculpture or a monument or a fountain or a fence line or boundary markers. So once we get past those, we'll get into what are districts. So a district is a collection or concentration of resources that are linked either historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. That can include as little as 2 resources, or it can be 100 resources. It really more than one. So although a district, the definition of what constitutes a district is really reliant upon the nature of the resources themselves. So is there a single dominant resource with a collection of outbuildings, or are these resources what we would classify as co-dominant? A good general question we often ask ourselves what districts are. If we remove any single resource from the district, would the district itself still be eligible for listing in the National Register from a significant standpoint? If the answer to that is yes, then we are most likely dealing, would it still be eligible for listing? So if the answer to that is yes, then we most likely are dealing with a district. So if we take away one resource and the entire thing is not eligible anymore, chances are that's not going to be a district. So moving along, so what are the National Register criteria? So when we evaluate individual properties or a district for eligibility for NR listing, we are really looking primarily for 3 things, and that is age, significance, and integrity, which I will touch base on a little bit later. In a nutshell, with significance, we are looking for F4 criteria. Criterion A, which is for event, criterion B, which is for biographical association with a significant individual, criterion C, which is design construction, and criterion D, which is archaeology. So when it comes to integrity, we are actually looking at 7 different aspects: location, setting, design, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. And again, I will go over that a little bit later as well. So when we are making an assessment of significance, we must determine first off whether the resource or district is of local, state, or national level significance. Although it is called the National Register, a resource only needs to be significant for the area in which it is located. So for instance, like with the Carrabelle Commercial District, it does not need to be significant for anything more than its association with the city of Carrabelle. So with age, we are generally looking at resources or district 50 years or older, except in limited circumstances where the resource in question is exceptionally significant, which is not going to be applicable to Carrabelle, so we don't have to worry about that. So, although arbitrary, the 50-year rule is a good standard rule for many reasons, including providing enough time to better evaluate the context and also eliminating the possibility of emotion being interjected into a potentially politically or personally charged recent event. So as I mentioned earlier, I do not like the definition the National Park Service did for the National Register, which is that it's, the official list of the nation's historical resources worthy of preservation. For the simple reason that when we give our assessments for listing, we are not giving value judgments on the resources or districts themselves. In other words, when we say a resource is not eligible for listing in the NR, it is really a statement on the limitation of the federal guidelines and criteria put forth by the National Park Service, and not a value judgment on the importance or worthiness for preservation of the resource or district being evaluated. So, going a little bit over the different criteria. So criterion A, in a general sense, of events or history. So as I mentioned before, there are 4 different criteria that we take into consideration when we evaluate significance. The National Park Service defines criterion A as association with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. And in order to make this assessment, there needs to be research done on the property or district and the community it is within in order to help better contextualize the resource. A determination must also be made as to the area of significance, the level of significance, and the period of significance. With districts such as the downtown Carrabelle Historic District, they are often significant under what we classify as community planning and development, which is defined as the design or development of the physical structure of the community. So moving along criterion B. So this is not really going to be applicable to the Carrabelle Historic District, but I think I'll go over this a little bit. So with this criterion, which is more properly defined as biographical association with a significant individual can be tricky. In order for this to apply, we must first make that determination that this period was indeed, that this person was indeed significant, and to ascertain what this person was significant for. The reason why this can be tricky is because it is tied to direct association. You have to demonstrate that this property or district is the best surviving resource directly associated with the activities which made this person significant. So for instance, if you have a mayor significant to a community's history for politics and government, whose offices were based in the city hall, what building would be more closely associated with the activities that made them significant? The city hall or their personal residence? It is important to note that criterion B can apply to personal residences, but it is done in a ranking order depending on what other extant properties are left that are associated with this significant individual. So to make a claim for criterion B, it was a matter of survey work as well as contact, doing the historical research on the person in the community. So given this complexity, criterion B nomination is scarcer than what criterion A and what we call criterion C nomination. So with criterion C, this is design and engineering. So this criterion is defined as resources that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high artistic value. In other words, these resources or collection of resources can be significant for architecture, engineering, or art, or they can be the work of a master architect, builder, or artist. It is important to note that buildings or districts can be eligible under criterion C, even if they lack the sort of architectural ornamentation that you normally expect for a lot of these buildings. Being the last extant example of a particular building type or form, such as a shotgun house, for instance, that was once ubiquitous to a particular community, can be run for a criterion C listing. Periods of significance and standards for integrity tend to be much stricter with criterion C nominations, and again, I'll discuss this a little later when we go into integrity. And so criterion D was, you know, again, this is not applicable to this nomination at hand, but we will not get into this too much, as this will not apply to the district, but criterion D is defined as resources that have yielded or may likely yield information important in prehistory or history. This generally applies to archaeological sites, but is not strictly confined to archaeology. Due to the professional level survey work often expected of archaeological sites, which includes shovel testing, artifact collection, and publication of formal reports, this is the rarest of the four criteria that we deal with on a given basis. So it's usually criterion A, criterion C, sometimes criterion B, and every once in a while, criterion D. So integrity. So this is sort of one of the baseline of things that we evaluate, one of the big three things. So when we evaluate integrity, we are looking for 7 things, and that is location, setting, design, workmanship, materials, association, and feeling. It is important to note that integrity and condition are not the same thing. A building can be in poor condition but maintain excellent integrity until the condition deteriorates to the point that the design, workmanship, and material integrity of that resource is impacted. Keep in mind, when we evaluate integrity, we not only need to know what the building is significant for, but we also need to understand what period of significance we are using. The end point of a building or district period of significance can be more than 50 years ago, depending on what the time period was for that significant activity. So going over the 7 different criteria. So location and setting are rather self-explanatory. Location defines the place on which the historic activity took place, and the setting describes the surroundings. Association is one of the 2 sort of intangible elements or aspects of integrity. And this is sort of an evaluation of the direct link between an event and the significant person and the property or the community itself. So the Carrabelle Historic District still has that association with the city of Carrabelle. So that's the integrity of association. And sometimes we do get that where, like, for instance, a building or a resource or a district that's associated with a community that is long ago gone. That association is completely gone. When we look at feeling, so feeling is, again, that's another one of the 2 intangible things. So a feeling is sort of when we take into consideration the totality of the design, the materials, the workmanship, the association, all that stuff, and does that building still convey its historicity? So So that kind of there's a little bit of flexibility there when it comes to evaluating that aspect of integrity. But feeling is the ability to convey an aesthetic and or a place and time. And feeling and association are in fact, as I mentioned before, are in effect intangible qualities in which overall assessment of the property and its surroundings are taken into account. So when we look at integrity, it's really so the real meat of most of these nominations from an integrity standpoint is going to be design, workmanship, and material. So all three of these aspects of integrity are tied together but are different. Design is defined as the combination of elements that create the form, plan, space, structure, and style of a property. Workmanship is the physical evidence of the craft of a particular culture or people during any period of time in history or prehistory. And materials are the physical elements that were combined or deposited during a particular period of time in a particular pattern of configuration to form a historic property. So evidence of workmanship and the type of materials used can be taken into account when evaluating design. So for instance, when we look at the brick patterns on a particular building, like a historic building, the material being brick, the design, the workmanship being the way that the bricks were made and the way the bricks were laid out, the design being the overall aesthetic of the brick facade. So there are certain elements that are all kind of interconnected in a way, right? So we look at what would be a good aspect of the material and design element of integrity would be horizontal wood frame siding on the exterior of the house. So that part of the design is the material. So, so at what point does a property reach a point where it is no longer eligible? And the answer to this really depends on the resource and the district at hand. As no two resources and districts are the same, the National Park Service has cut the standards for evaluating integrity intentionally flexible. Certain aspects of integrity are more important for properties eligible under criterion A and B than for criterion C, for instance, and vice versa. So for instance, when we're looking at something eligible for its historical association, a biographical association, then the integrity of location and setting and association are far more important than they are with design, workmanship, and material, but they are not completely divorced, right? And on the flip side, when we're looking at something that we're trying to evaluate for criterion C, the design, the workmanship, and material integrity is going to be taken into paramount importance over, say, location and setting. So we've had relocated properties that were listed for architecture that were nowhere near their original location and nowhere near their original setting. So it really kind of depends on the resource. So think of, yeah, so it does not mean, however, that the resource is, even though we emphasize certain aspects of integrity more so than others with resources, it doesn't mean that they are completely divorced from all 7 aspects of integrity. With historically significant property, for instance, the elements of design we look at must still be there enough for evidence of past historic function. So an old schoolhouse must still be, you must still be able to visually convey its historic function as a schoolhouse. You know, just our standards for the design and workmanship and materials are a little bit more stringent when we look at it from a criteria C perspective. So, what are the benefits of National Register designation? So, obviously, you have here the production of a written history and the public awareness of a property or a district. So, there are some limited direct benefits that come with NR designation. So, for instance, for a district like Carrabelle, where there are a significant percentage of commercial properties, up to 20% of most of the cost of a certified historic rehabilitation of an income-producing property listed on the National Register can be used toward a federal income tax credit. There are also certain limited protections and exemptions from certain FEMA regulations. There are also you also get certain levels of protection and review, and for instance, if there's a state or federal, we have a compliance staff over here at the State or Preservation Office, so whenever there's a project that involves state or federal money, state or federal properties, or state or federal permitting, it's required to go through that review. But the one thing to keep in mind with that is potential eligibility has the same effect as full National Register listing. So I guess the one benefit full National Register listing is that it can take a lot of the guesswork out of when they hire the consultant do the cultural resource assessment surveys they do and try to determine what kind of boundary they're going to use and when they try to determine the area of potential effect for a particular project. So what I'll go ahead and do here is move on to the next one. So the National Register Review Board. So all nominations within the state of Florida that is outside of federal or tribal lands are prepared by the Florida State Historic Preservation Office and presented before the Florida National Register Review Board. This is an independent board of professionals in the field of architecture, architectural history, and archaeology, who meet quarterly to evaluate National Register nominations prepared by our office. The board will either approve, reject, or table the proposal. Once approved, the State Historic Preservation Office staff will then begin the process of preparing the nomination for submission to the National Park Service, which has up until 45 days upon receipt of the proposal to either approve, reject, or return nomination for revision. The district is not considered listed until it is formally signed off on by the keeper of the National Register in Washington, D.C. So, moving on to the next slide. So, how do owners formally object to listing? So, in order for an owner to object to listing, they would need to either submit a notarized statement of objection to listing or to provide a written statement under the penalty of perjury stating that you are the owner of the property and object to listing in accordance with 28 U.S.C. 1746, which is one of the federal regulations. It is important to note that in our district are all in or all out. There is no opting out for individual owners. Every private property owner within the district, including those who own non-contributing or vacant properties, will get an opportunity to object. If 50% plus one of all unique private property owners within the district object, then the nomination would be essentially killed, and instead will become what's called a determination of eligibility. This DOE is essentially the same process as a nomination, including presentation before the Florida National Register Review Board and submission to the National Park Service. The only difference is the resource or district would not be considered listed until a sufficient number of unique property owners formally lift their objection. The unique private property owners. So moving on. So okay, so now we're going to go a little bit into the Carrabelle Historic District. So again, just touching base on this a little bit. So the downtown Carrabelle Historic District is a district comprising of 41 total resources confined primarily to the historic downtown commercial core of Carrabelle. The buildings encompass a collection of buildings that have historically served as the commercial and governmental core of the community. The buildings are primarily early to mid 20th century commercial vernacular concrete. They are primarily commercial, early to mid 20th century commercial vernacular buildings or concrete block construction are concentrated primarily along Marine Street and Tallahassee Street with significant secondary concentrations along Avenue B Southeast and St. James Avenue. Historically, the governmental function of the district occurred along Avenue B Southeast between Marine and Berry Street. The proposed downtown Carrabelle Historic District is what we are proposing is locally significant under what we call Criterion A for community planning and development, commerce, and government. And we're also proposing Criterion C for architecture. The period of significance extends from circa 1900, which is the date of construction of the oldest building, the estimated date of construction of the oldest active building within the district, to 1972, which is again a 50-year cutoff that I alluded to earlier. So the proposed district contains a collection of buildings that comprise, again, we're going over a little bit, comprise the historic commercial and governmental core of Carrabelle. The district also contains a locally significant collection of early to mid 20th century commercial architecture and significant building types such as the A.B. Simmons Fish House, which is the last or one of the last extant fish houses along the Carrabelle River. The district is also significant for containing several examples of the work of master builder Marvin Justice, who I'm sure Tamara Allen here can probably tell more about Marvin Justice than me. But so the resources within the district contain a collection of resources that extend across the varied history and transition of Carrabelle from a railroad town reliant on commercial fishing to a roadside highway community drawing from recreational fishing and tourism, essentially up to the present day. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is kind of go over some of the photographs that are with the nomination and kind of just give a little bit of, touch a little bit as to what is in the nomination. So, well, first of all, yeah, so this is the proposed district map, and I believe Michael Pace had a nice billboard-sized version of that map that we can kind of go over. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, the core of the district is primarily concentrated along Tallahassee Street and I believe it was St. James? Marine Street, sorry. With a little bit of extension along Avenue B Southeast and a little bit of extension along the waterway, along the highway. And, you know, so that pretty much, you know, they have a nice big blowing up version there. So I appreciate you guys for doing that, by the way. So, again, so that's sort of the district map. I'm going to go over some of the images that we took within the district. And I know a lot of you are already familiar with some of these images, but we'll go over them anyway. So, again, this is sort of a photo of Marine Street facing north towards the highway. And again, you kind of see sort of the commercial buildings that are within the district. What we have here, and this is sort of a little bit of an image of the Carrabelle waterfront that sort of along Marine Street. Again, I'm sure a lot of you are just familiar with these images already. This is an image here, again, just a setting shot showing Tallahassee Street facing to the south towards the highway. Let's see the fourth one. Yeah, so the fourth one, so this is an image of Everett Trading Post at 208 Marine Street. This building is sort of a good surviving example of sort of that, again, that mid-century kind of commercial vernacular architecture that's found within Carrabelle. So this next one. And this is probably one of the most significant, or if not the most significant, individual building within the district. So this is of the Carrabelle City Hall / what's now known as Carrabelle History Museum. It was built during the 1930s as part of the larger New Deal era program. And as I'm sure many of you know, in here, for many years it served as the City Hall and also served, I believe, as the police station, right? So, moving along, there's also a good example of the work of Marvin Justice, sort of the master builder for the community. This is the old Rex Theater, which was converted into the, I believe, the Carrabelle State Bank in the early 1970s. So this building kind of a good example of sort of the evolution that you often see in a lot of mid-century commercial districts, where obviously you look at it now, it does not look like a movie theater anymore, but the building in its current configuration from the early 1970s, when it was converted into a bank, that's how it looks now. It still accurately kind of reflects that early 1970s appearance, right at the very tail end of the period of significance for this district. We were fortunately able to find very good documentation in the Tallahassee newspaper showing images of this building looking very similar from 1971, 72. So
it's the Gulf State Bank. Gulf State Bank.
The Gulf State Bank, sorry about that. Yes, Gulf State Bank, sorry. Let's see. So what we have here, so this is the image of Real Carrabelle. This is one of the gas stations, the historic gas stations that are within Carrabelle. Most of the historic gas stations are missing, I guess we call it, sort of their forecourt, so that little shelter that will go over the top of the gas pump back in the day. It was, so this one, again, it's one of the early to mid 20th century gas stations. I believe this was a Standard Oil station, is that correct?
It's across the road.
Yeah.
Standard Oil was across the road from that.
Yeah. So moving along here, this is the post office, you guys know. It's a good example of sort of mid 20th century, mid-century modern institutional architecture that is found within the district. It definitely contributes architecturally and also as part of the overall government functions of the building, the government and commercial function of the building. So moving along here, this is the fish house. So again, this is one of the last, probably the last along the Carrabelle River, sort of harken back to an era, sort of what we call like an industrial resource. Sort of harken back to an era when the town was really reliant upon commercial fishing. So this is this image of the Carrabelle water plant. And one of the reasons why we extended the boundary out here is to make sure that we go ahead and include this. Now, the building itself is non-contributing due to the condition issues that have progressed to the point of affecting the material and design integrity of the building. However, there are support structures found on site that are considered contributing. Once repaired, this building will make an excellent amendment opportunity to the historic district, which may help further with preservation depending on what is being done with it. And as I mentioned before, most of the properties within the proposed district are commercial or governmental in nature. There are a few residential examples. And what this image is of here is the image of the Catholic Banks residence at 303 Avenue B Southeast. It's one of the few private residential buildings within the district. And the private residences that are within the district are primarily concentrated along the east side of the district along Avenue B. So I think that concludes my little presentation. And so I hope I got off to at least got off to a good start.
Thank you.
Maybe an instant question.
Now, I have had an opportunity to review. I haven't read every word, but I have looked at your application. It's a fine application that you worked with Mr. Pace, Mr. Michael Pace, and Ms. Tamara Allen have worked together on that. Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and then we'll let the other commissioners ask some questions, and then we'll let the audience ask questions or make comments. How will all of the citizens and the property owners that, or actually I should say the property owners, how will they be notified of public meetings? You told me that there's going to be a meeting or two.
Yeah, no, we will try to have a formal public meeting of the district. So we have a notification requirement for the district, but we have to either send out newspaper notices, or either send out individual letters to the owners, or send out a notice through the newspaper, through the general newspaper of circulation. Generally, given the smaller size of the district, we are most likely going to be leaning towards sending out individual letters. And those are usually going to be out the door between 30 to 45 days before the particular meeting. And what we ideally want to do is have this presented before that window of notification goes out the door. So we don't want people to be, receive a letter out of left field and then be like, what the heck's going on? So generally, and those are details that we're going to have to work out. We'll definitely keep the city apprised of this, and once we figure out where we're going to meet, when we're going to meet, how the notice is going to be handled, we would definitely do that. So, I mean, there's a requirement for us in regard to how we notice the Florida National Register Review Board meeting, but what sort of the public outreach meeting, we kind of play it a little bit by ear sometimes to see. So we could, for instance, send out earlier notification letters for the public meeting here in Carrabelle. We can, get word of mouth advertising. We kind of play it by ear.
How do we know that you have notified all the property owners? How will you get their addresses?
So with the notices for the Florida National Register Review Board, we sign and scan every letter. Sometimes, obviously we do auto pen. It's like, for instance, we have a community where we have 500 resources. We're like, okay, we're not going to have somebody sign 500 pieces of paper, but we have sort of an auto pen. But they were scanned and kept on file.
As a record.
And they're the official record for this nomination process, because that is part of our federal responsibilities. We have to notify the chief elected official of the city, that will be notifying you. We have to notify the chief elected official of the county, which would be the chairman of the, generally he's going to be the chairman of the county board of county commissioners. And then we either send out individual letters to the owners, or we do a newspaper notice. So.
Okay. If a property owner doesn't vote, then is that included in your percentage, or how does that work?
We take no response as an implied yes.
Okay.
So they have to positively affirm in the negative, if that makes any sense. They have to reach out to us and say, I object to this.
What is a unique private property owner?
So unique private property owners, so what we do, we gather together the list. So as you know, a lot of times there'll be one entity that will own like 3 or 4 parcels, or there'll be like 4 people that will own 1 parcel. We take each individual unique owner that is an official owner of record of a particular parcel that is within the boundary, and we determine what the number of unique private property owners within that district. And the reason why, obviously, that we want to keep track of that is we need to know where that 50% number is. So the 50% plus one, as I mentioned before, 50% plus one of the unique private property owners within the district affirmatively object, then the nomination process effectively comes to an end as a National Register nomination. What it then becomes is what we call the determination of eligibility, which is basically, this is why we try, before we even try to write a nomination, we try to get, we very rarely, for instance, do district nominations without somebody from the community reaching over to us. And we always try to do our work and make sure that the people that we're working with are actively communicating with the people as we are writing the nomination. Because honestly, in an ideal world, I wouldn't want them to be caught by surprise when we have a public meeting either. And so that's pretty much it.
So if someone owns, one person owns 4 properties, how many votes is that one vote?
One.
Okay, and if 4 people, how does that work? They still give, if 3 people own 1 property, how does that work?
Then I'll become just 3 unique owners. That's just the way the Park Service, so we are adhering to federal regulations.
Okay, that's not fair. We all agree.
So it can be a bit, when you start to get into some of the technical side of when it comes to notification and things of that nature, it can get a bit tricky. But I think the important thing is that we count unique property owners as one person or entity. So in other words,
and so when they respond negatively, they have to, that has to be by a notarized statement, so they have to get it notarized as well.
So it's not just notarized, I think,
which costs, how much does it cost here to get notarized? $10? That's not fair either. It's free at the bank.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, it can be either a notarized objection, or again, kind of using the technical language, or provide a written statement under the penalty of perjury stating you are the owner of the property and object to it in accordance with 28 U.S.C. 1746. So you don't have to get it notarized.
All right.
You just have to give a statement, and we'll provide the language, in the notification letters and things like that. Like, here's how you set this up if you object. You don't have to get, you can go that route. And up until relatively recently, that was the only route that the National Park Service went with. Right? We've been directed from above from the Park Service that they kind of loosened the objection requirements a little bit.
Okay, that's good then. And I'm glad you'll be providing explanation on how they actually need to write their statement. Okay, so then the way I understand it, we talked for quite some time on the phone, and I appreciate the time you spent with me to explain how this happens. I requested that the word proposed be there because when we say just plain out like he was submitting it in the first place, and that we show this to the public, he didn't have proposed. And we don't, that makes the public think we have a downtown historic district or any kind of a historic district, and the city of Carrabelle, right now, this minute, does not have a designated historic district.
Yes, and that's sort of the thesis statement of this nomination is that there is potentially a historic district there. And, again, the city is welcome to, if you guys have, any issues with the nomination as far as, what our basis for evaluation is, or any of those things, or if you don't agree that it's eligible as a National Register district, please feel free. We're always open to criticism or input or anything of that nature. So.
Okay, so now I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, if they get their 50 votes plus 1 or 50% plus 1, and so they're ready to submit, they will remove that word proposed, and their submission, that long application that we all saw, will just say, the title of it will be the Downtown Carrabelle Historic District. because that application, or that registration application that we, Ms. Courtney sent around, that will be the final document if it's accepted by the review board. That will be the final document, and they won't make changes to it. So once it's accepted by the National Register of Historic Places, then that proposed area that they have right now will become a National Historic District.
Right,
Okay.
and I should add that it's substantially done. So in other words, the meat and potatoes of that nomination are not going to change. We're going to keep the boundary as is, we're going to keep the contributing, non-contributing resources as is, and things of that nature. There may be, we do give ourselves some flexibility for further tinkering with the nomination. If there's additional, some additional context clarification or some of the technical things that we may have missed in this version of the draft that we pick up on the last version. We may make those little changes, but substantially it is done. And we have no problem keeping the word proposed in there, even if it goes before the Florida National Register Review Board. I think we'll just change it to Downtown Carrabelle Historic District after it goes to the review board and get submitted to the Park Service. Because that's just the general lingo of the National Register nomination. We don't keep the word proposed when we put together a historic district nomination.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
And if I could.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
And to follow up on that, and the way I look at it and assume it's a proposed project until it's approved by the review board.
Yes, it's actually, it's a proposed project until the keeper of the register officially signs off on it. It's not actually listed until it goes to the Florida National Register Review Board. We submit it to the National Park Service. They have up to 45 days upon receipt of the nomination. And as I mentioned before, they're either going to, it's either going to be yes, no, or we need more information or more clarification. And so the National Register, generally speaking from experience, by the time a proposal gets to the National Park Service, it's usually going to be yes, or we need more information. Because generally, we hear at the State Historic Preservation Office staff, we really don't want to waste anybody's time with something that's not eligible. And so generally, we try to be pretty thorough with our review and our assessment of properties and districts before we even get to the Florida National Register Review Board. Because as I mentioned before, these are actually professionals that are volunteering their time. And so we wouldn't want to take advantage of that by putting something before them that we feel doesn't stand a chance. And so because of the fact that our review board has 5 professionals, 2 archaeologists, a historian, an architect, and an architectural historian, and they sign off on it, it's not a guarantee that the Park Service will say yes, but the Park Service does take that into consideration when they receive it, that it went through the Florida National Register Review Board, and that it went through staff review as well. So.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead. And
If and when the project is approved and it comes to reality, what effects, negative or positive, or if any, would it have on city government?
None. The National Register listing in itself did not prohibit a public or private owner from doing whatever they see fit with the property. And there are some impact when it comes to like compliance reviews. So for instance, the highway that goes right through the middle of town. But when we do what we call cultural resource assessment surveys, potential eligibility is taken into the same account as full National Register listing. So theoretically, nothing will technically change as far as like any additional restrictions or limitations. The one thing I always tell people is that historic preservation, the real enforcement of it comes at the local level. So like the assumption that a lot of people have when it comes to things related to government is that the higher up you go in government, the more power they assume. But historic preservation is the exact opposite. Like all I can do in my capacity with the state is list or delist a property or a district. And we have some compliance staff, but our compliance staff, they do review projects, but they are largely advisory. There's very few things we do in our office that's regulatory in terms of like when we say something, you have to do it. So ultimately, when we go through a compliance process, ultimately it is up to, for instance, if it's a state or federal agency, it's ultimately up to that state or federal agency what gets done with the project. So.
Okay, thank you. One other question. again, going the same route if and when the historical district is approved, what positive or negative effects may it have on a property's tax base?
None that I'm aware. Maybe Ruben might be able to.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, my name is Ruben Acosta, I'm the Bureau Chief at the Bureau of Historic Preservation. So Andrew's one of my staff. Regarding tax base, since the National Register program is primarily an honorary program, it shouldn't be directly impacting the taxes unless people decide to value themselves and assess themselves how much they want to increase or decrease, but we don't have any control over that, and there's no mandatory requirement. There's no requirement that a person must preserve their property, either private property owner or public owner. There is no limitation on what they can do in terms of maintenance, additions, demolitions, all that stuff. We regularly have to delist properties from the National Register because they've been demolished, because we don't have any control over that. So it's not supposed to directly impact the tax base. There is the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit, where if a person owns a historically designated property that's income generating, like a business or a rental, and they rehabilitate that property, 20% of the money they invest in that property can get back as an income tax credit. So that's literal money that you subtract from how much you owe to the federal government. Currently, through the state legislature, there is a bill going through to create a state historic preservation tax credit program where if you are paying business taxes or you are paying, like, I believe it's like insurance franchise taxes, it's one of those other kind of like income-based taxes for business owners, and they own a historically designated property and they're taking advantage of the federal program, they can also get a 20% tax credit on their state business taxes if they own an income-generating historically designated property. If that property is located within a recognized Main Street community, which I think the closest one to here is Apalachicola, just down the road, they would get an extra 10% on top of that, so they could get up to 30% tax credit on their rehabilitation. But that's just something that's going through the legislature right now. It's not an actual law yet. We're hoping that it goes through because that would be a very good boon for owners of historic properties. But in terms of you all's local taxes and in terms of local regulations and stuff like that, there shouldn't be an impact. Designation on the National Register will not require the city of Carrabelle to do anything in terms of additional regulation or oversight for your properties and things like that. There is no imposition of any types of requirements upon local government. It will grant you flexibility in working with your floodplain manager in regards to your historic properties when you are working with FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. There are certain waivers that are written into federal law that apply to historically designated properties within historic districts. And then there are several other things. And to clarify a little bit with Andrew, when it comes to the whole compliance thing, that's between our office and whatever federal or state agency is managing a project, funding a project, or permitting the project. Usually the property owner, the local government, and stuff like that isn't directly involved in that process unless that federal agency or that state agency specifically delegates their responsibility to the applicant. That's very rare. Most of the time we're working directly with DEP for like water management permits and things like that, or we're working directly with FDOT regarding the road projects. So again, that's agency to agency, higher up, that does not directly impact the people on the ground who actually own the resources and things like that. The goal of the program is to provide recognition and to provide people with access to a set of tools to help them manage their properties. There's no requirement that they have to use those tools, and we are not the preservation police. When I'm at full staff, I have 3 National Register historians who are responsible for the entire state of Florida. We have over 1,800 listed properties in the state, including historic districts and individual listings. that include over 50,000 resources total. We have historic districts that range from 3 buildings all the way up to over 1,000. So City of Key West is entirely one entire historic district. Your friends down the road, Apalachicola, they are one big historic district. The people who own that, and they've been a historic district down in Apalachicola since 1975, if I remember correctly. So their historic designation is almost old enough to itself be historic. And that would be actually something really interesting to look into about doing, providing historic recognition for historic preservation, historic.
Thank you for your long answer. That was a good one.
Yeah.
And you described some positives there, possibly for the property owners. And I asked that question because I've heard, and the property owners I would want to know in the district, because I've heard some conversation that the designation of historic would increase your property values. Listen, I don't know that as a fact. It's the reason why I ask you.
Yeah,
If I were a property owner, that's one thing, that's one question that I would like answered. And thank you for your long answer. It was a good one.
Certainly.
And they may want their property value improved, or they may not, because if it's improved, they're gonna pay more tax, so,
Right.
and, we wanna, everything needs to be up front before they make their vote. And I've had someone mention that possibly they wouldn't pay tax if it was in a historic district. So they still continue to pay their ad valorem tax. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not the expert.
Yeah. Under state law, if a county chose to create an ad valorem tax program for historic properties, they actually have the ability to do so, where you can incentivize people to rehabilitate their properties by essentially creating a program where if I invest $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 in my property and it results in an equal increase in the property value, if that program existed at the county or city level, that ordinance would say, hey, you've invested this money in a historic property. What we're going to do is for a specific period of time, 5 years, 10 years, however long the local ordinance is set, we are going to not tax you at your new value, we'll tax you at your old value for that time period. And at the end, we'll allow it ramp up to the new value. As a way of incentivizing that investment, they postpone their tax bill a little bit, offsetting the cost of the investment, but eventually that the community would gain the corresponding increase, right, coming back into the municipal coffers. But that's not something that we do. That's all controlled at the local level, whether at the county or at the city.
Okay, then I just want to clarify one thing too. This is not putting any building code requirements or restrictions or architectural requirements on if this passes through the review board.
No.
That will not, that will not happen.
As I mentioned before, all I can do in my capacity with the National Register program is list or delist a property or a district.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did have one question. I know you mentioned if this application that we were reviewing would be the one submitted. I have one of the buildings downtown and I know some of the information needs to be changed a little bit. Who could I let that know to?
Right here, I'm the one that's been working on the nomination. He's too high up to be working on any of the nominations now.
I just proofread and edit now.
Yeah, so you reach out to me, and again, we're always open to if there's any incorrect information, anything needs to be clarified, corrected.
And that's something we would want to do before?
Yeah, you ideally want to do this before, especially before the Florida National Register Review Board, especially before the National Park Service. So what we want absolutely set before it goes anywhere is, and this is something we want set before the community is even made aware of this nomination, is we want the boundary and the contributing and non-contributing resources set by that point. So there's some flexibility with some of the changes to the nomination beyond that, but essentially So when I'm talking about like the absolute core, it is substantially done. So I don't foresee any such really substantial changes from the nomination as written right now and what could put before the Park Service. However, again, if you, I'll be more than happy as well. I think I provided you a copy, but anybody in the public, just reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to provide copies of the nomination for your review. And again, if there's anything that needs to be clarified, corrected, if you feel there's a mistaken assessment of a building that should be contributing or not contributing, and vice versa, we're all ears. We're, you know, it's nothing set in stone. So.
Okay, I want to ask Commissioner Gray, do you, you know, because you, I believe his building is in there as well, isn't it? It's in that. You have anything, any concerns or comments?
Not so far, all my questions have been
Okay,
answered.
make sure. It's a good opportunity to get your questions answered. Mr. Key, Commissioner Walden?
I've covered all.
Okay. All right, let's let the audience, if they want to ask some questions.
Does that run up and include in the Methodist Church and that entire block?
No, the Methodist Church is not included in that, and the reason why. So when we looked at, so one of the things that was going on when we were writing this nomination, first of all, was COVID that was going on. But one of the things that was going on after we were writing the nomination was that there was a countywide survey being done in connection to Hurricane Michael Gray. So we have people actively going through Franklin County, and they were surveying areas of resources that were not recorded in previous surveys. And we felt that it would be a better nomination if we could just focus on the downtown core now, and then in the future, when we have more information at hand, where we could better be able to assess buildings that were from the mid-century period, residential buildings from the mid-century period, we can use that information to sort of gather together a residential district to the north of downtown. So that is a possible phase two.
Well,
that was sort of our line of thinking when we looked at that. And initially, I think there was a church like right adjacent to where the district is. I think that's at the Methodist Church. I think so.
No, it's on up 67. So a Methodist church was built in 1900 is why I asked.
Yeah,
And
so-
the entire block of houses that sits there, and from where you stopped at Gander's coming on up, all those houses were built in the middle to late 1900s.
Yeah, and there was a really good concentration. I know from having walked through this community and then having seen what was already been done with the late 19th, early 20th, the mid 20th century. There was a very good concentration of buildings. And again, as I mentioned before, we felt that would be better addressed with a sort of a residential district where we could take into account the Hurricane Michael surveys that were done in Franklin County.
Why would you address it differently when, I mean, if you ask the old timers here, downtown Carrabelle would start actually right above the church right there and come on down. That's what downtown Carrabelle consisted of that. So that's always included in your historic park.
So generally speaking, the National Park Service discourages full community nomination of full community districts. So that was sort of our line of thinking when we took a look at the concentration of resources at hand. We know that there was a concentration, there were a few residential buildings that got taken that are in this district, but when we looked at sort of the larger story and sort of the significance of the buildings that we were focusing on, we felt that that was a better addressed separately from the elements of the district that was to the north. So we're talking about the commercial core, the governmental core, and it was really largely for the most part, a single function of the district boundary that we selected. So we felt that having a possible second district with the residences taking into account the mid-century surveys and incorporating the churches and some of the other resources that are closer connected to the residential areas, that we felt that was better addressed that way. So
I was just wondering, because, the sad thing about it is it would have been nicer if this would have been more advertised to where more than just two people had input in it, because, I mean, because I can't see the maps far away. Did y'all even, did you even include, the old post office, the old post office originally was further down Marine Street, not the one you have, which, yes, that's.
Yes, we're talking about the one that was, that near,
On Avenue B.
yeah,
Down
the
towards
one that was,
the
yeah, that's
boat
included in
ramp.
there.
Okay.
Ms. Nikki, I believe I understood from Mr. Waber that, and at one point I asked him on the phone, I said, how can you just, he wasn't telling me everything. I said, well, how can you just come and declare a certain area of Carrabelle to be on the National Register? And he then explained to me that Ms. Tamara and Mr. Michael Pace have been working together, and they came to him with a proposal.
So, along with, to the north there, we have 2 or 3 ancient sand dunes, which are deep. There, very few towns have preserved their ancient sand dunes. Most of them have harvested their dunes, and we're so fortunate. And I would like to see somewhere along the line that designation. Those sand dunes are amazing. Anybody that likes to walk, that's a good trail, and they're wonderful. We do have to deal with erosion a bit, but we have ancient sand dunes, and my house on Avenue A was built in 1890 or 1895. Yeah, so, you know, that is relevant, that area, but the sand dunes really are a treasure. And I think maybe even more than an individual house. The sand dunes are pretty amazing.
The sad thing, even though it gets put, that's just like these buildings, they can go tear them down if they
Well,
want.
that's right, but
They don't
it does
stop
give you
nothing, yeah.
some credibility to say, wait a minute, let's think about this. This is a national, with something there to slow the process down, maybe. I agree with you, it's not gonna really affect anybody, any developer that wanted to build up on that sand dune so they have a view of the Gulf like you have in Destin, you know, perish the thought.
Yeah.
But, you know, it would help.
If we ever pursue get to a point where we pursue a residential district to the north, that's definitely something we can take into account as part of these settings. So we generally do not list natural features, but that is certainly something that we call into account when we talk about, again, the setting, you know, what is the setting of the community? It's up on a sand dune, or a portion of the district rather is up on a sand dune. So that is something that we do take into, that we can take into account in the future.
You just think we can talk from here?
Just go ahead, yes, that's fine.
I'm not sure you can hear me from here because I'll talk to you these days first. Okay. Sorry, I have my back. Okay. My name's Tamara Allen, and I'm currently running the Carrabelle History Museum, but I wanted to go back and give y'all a little bit of history. The first discussion of the proposed downtown historic district actually came out of the original creation of the Carrabelle Historical Society, which was done back in 2005. And there were meetings that were held at the library, and I know you all know Miss Lillian Smith and Miss Mary Westberg and Mel Kelly, Steve Allen, myself, and a group of other people began meeting to talk about how could we protect and appreciate the historical background of the town. And one of the things that came up during that time was the notion that we would have a historical district. And later on, the city decided to go for an application to the state to become a Carrabelle, a waterfront partnership community. And when we did that, those people I just mentioned, plus another dozen people, became the active group on how would we implement a law that says, among other things, that we had to come up with a program to appreciate, to recognize and protect historical and cultural resources. So we were working on this in 2005. We were working on it in 2007.
city got a designation as a waterfront partnership in 2007. We got a grant for a historic survey, a document to be done. We got a state grant to do that. And that document, which was done in 2009, the grant year, actually recommended that there be 2 historical districts in the town. And those were one that went, as he said, up through the district, the business district, followed by up into the residential district. And another one over where the World War II,
The barracks.
the barracks for the people using the oil, what was that, the oil pipeline that they used during World War II. That being a separate one, but a lot of the discussion, it's not anything new that's happened. What's happened over the years is we've talked to Mr. Acosta's office innumerable times with innumerable people, both from Carrabelle and from their office, and every little pieces, different pieces have gotten put together. But we haven't had an intense effort to write up each of the eligible or potentially eligible properties until Michael Pace and Pat came to town and put energy behind actually getting the survey documents written. And we started doing more research than we had ever done, and we got to looking at other things. So there have been hundreds of people from Carrabelle who have been involved over the years in talking about, well, how could we benefit from a historic district? How could we get tax credits to help encourage some of those key property owners in downtown to fix their buildings because they were literally crumbling before our very eyes? And we thought the federal tax credit would be a good way to do that. We've also been looking at how could we help not, after a hurricane, how could we make it so that we did not have to put these old buildings up on stilts in order to meet the FEMA requirements. And so, as he's already explained, those are 2 really important things that happen as a result of becoming a district. But it's not been just the last few years. There has been an enormous amount of work done, research and documentation done, and working with Andrew on trying to get this together. So I just think we have to keep remembering this has been a long-term application of a commitment that the city adopted the report back in 2009 when we had the waterfront partnership. We have it on the city website. I looked at it last night, it's still there. It says create a historical district in downtown. So I think this is just the evolution of a process that started a long time ago when people, and I always think it all started with Walter Mallett, Mary Westberg, and Lillian Smith. They were the energy that we all got behind and they caused us to want to do this because you all knew them and you know how wonderfully crazy about this town they were. So, but I just wanted to kind of add that piece of history that I don't think everybody's really aware of, how we got to be where we are today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tamara. We appreciate that. And Mr. Steve?
I have a couple of questions, just for clarification. So as I understood you to say, we have a commercial governmental district. Let's say there's an adjacent property to that sort of falls in that kind of category. Is it difficult to expand that designated district by adding adjacent properties that would, or do y'all feel like the core district y'all have are only available that meet for that category?
Well, it depends where at in the process you are.
Yeah,
So we have a lot more flexibility. Obviously, by the time we bring this to the public and by the time we bring this to the Florida National Register Review Board, as I mentioned before, we want that resource count and district boundary kept as is. There is always a possibility when, so we write the nomination, we submit it, it goes to the Florida National Register Review Board, the National Park Service signs off on it, there is always the possibility to amend the district if upon, a lot of times, like for instance, we have like older nominations where, 10, 20, 30, or like talk about Key West 50 years ago going on. A lot could happen in 50 years, and buildings that would not have been eligible for contributing are now historic, right? And so when we talk about, so that there's a big difference with the type of amendment. The big difference with an amendment, for instance, where you're talking about amending the boundary, is that it has to be treated in the same way as a full nomination, right. But what the owners of the affected property owner, of the affected area needing to be notified. So if it's the boundary, the owners within the boundary, they don't have to be notified, but if you bend it like 5 blocks this way or half a mile that way, then we need to basically go through a whole nomination process, similar to what we're doing now, but for the affected property owner. And again, if somebody comes over to me, first thing, that's when Tamara and Michael Pace and the group that they were with, when they initially reached out to me, one of the first things I said was, have you talked to people in the community? Right. Because, we want to gauge community support before we even spend any time at all writing the nomination. And it's a similar thing with an amendment, where like, okay, we feel the boundary should be pushed this, to the west or to the north or whatever. Make sure that this proposed area, first of all, you have the context together, the integrity of the resources are there, but make sure you do the legwork with the owners in the affected property area to make sure that they're aware and that they support this proposed amendment.
Okay, and then I got a couple of follow-up.
I need to just ask a question though. Mr. Royce, how long does it take you to set up?
Maybe 10 minutes.
Okay, so we have, let me see here, and we want to take a little break, so less than 8 minutes.
Just real quick, I understood you to say that there's no reason why we couldn't start after or at any point working on the second historic district.
Right.
That would be a residential district that would take on some of the older houses that are sort of
And the
in
churches.
adjacent areas. So then we would have to, and then the third question I have is, let's say that I'm a person who's just fascinated with history and I love National Historic Properties. Is there anything that the National Park Service does with the history that sort of allows me to understand, when I'm making decisions to go visit places, do they have a website, a list of all, do those things show up on maps? What effort is there from that national group to market historic travel or anything like that that would cause people to come to visit ours as opposed to going to a city that didn't have a historic district?
Well, as far as the National Register program within the Park Service, which is really what I'm more intimately familiar with, the promotion of tourism is not really part of their sort of mission, but they do have a very large digitization project where all of the old nomination and the new nomination that gets submitted, they are now submitted digitally. So it's all digital now. When I first started, everything was printed out. We had to send them black and white photographs on paper and like all that stuff. And yeah, so I can gather together their website, but I believe it's nps.gov/NR.
So basically, it shows up on maps and Google Maps and things where those districts are sort of, you're driving through town, you're looking at your map, and you see a bank, and you see, a historic marker or a historic district.
Yeah, you could reach out to our Florida Master Site File staff. They do have options where they can filter out results and provide maps for, or at least location information site file form for, and our listed resources and district and so on and so forth. But usually a lot of that stuff that you see online, for instance, like Wikipedia does all that stuff, that's really more enthusiasts that are involved with that than the Park Service itself.
All right, Mr. Hartman, our attorney has.
Quick question for Mr. Rubin.
Yes.
When you mentioned kind of liaising with DOT
Yes.
and Water Management District, what does that look like? What role do you all play with them?
Usually what happens is when, like if DOT is gonna be doing work out here on 98, their processes, because most of the funding comes from the federal government, they're required to contact our office. The requirement falls on them to reach out to us and say, is there any historic resources along this road? And then we would check our files and we would respond. A lot of times they will pay a consultant to do a survey along that area to make sure they're not missing anything. And then it goes through a consultation process between their office and our office as to, are there any historic properties? Are they going to be impacted by the project? If they are going to be impacted, what is the type of impact? How can that be either avoided, mitigated, or if it can't be mitigated or avoided, how do we offset that adverse impact? So it's a process that we handle ourselves with whatever agency is going through that project. Same thing with like water management permits and things like that. That's usually all part of the permit application process, the cultural resource assessment.
It's Florida Statute 267, so we call that a 267 review in our office.
So if there's an application to the water management service, then those questions will be on
Yeah,
there. It's similar to our CDBG applications.
Yeah, and
Okay.
like, for example, CDBG is federal money.
Mhm.
The part of that process through Department of Agriculture, they contact our office and they're like, there's a grant, is this impacting historic resource?
Mhm.
And if it is, we let them know and they take that into account when they are reviewing those applications.
Okay.
Understood.
Any follow-up or anything? Okay, all right. I think maybe we should take one more question with a short answer. No, not much longer, because Mr. Royce needs to set up and we need to take a break. We've got about a 2-hour meeting.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to ask, beyond Andrew's effort, how would this district be signed in addition to the,
Ladies, please.
how would this district be signed in addition to the sign which already exists in front of Rio Carrabelle? Would there be additional markers at each end of the district, or would it simply leave at that one?
No, and our listing does not come, like, we don't provide plaques. Usually when you see those NR plaques, they are through private vendors. Do people reach out to private vendors and have that? We do give a certificate, like a nice calligraphy certificate, but we do have a state marker program, but that is completely unconnected to the National Register.
Very quickly, FDOT does put up the brown signs for historic districts, but that's only for National Register listed ones. The city would request those from FDOT.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to adjourn because we've got to get ready for a meeting.
Thank you
Thank you all.
guys so much.
Thank you.